Madison Square Garden, October 1976. Mike Mentzer walks off the stage as IFBB Mr. America. Confirmed, first place, official record. Every judge scored him for first. Almost every judge. According to an account that has circulated in bodybuilding circles for decades, but has never been confirmed against primary documentation, one judge that night gave his vote not to Mentzer, but to Roger Callard, a documented friend and sometime training partner of Arnold Schwarzenegger. That judge, reportedly, was Arnold, serving on a panel at a contest where his associate was competing. No scoring sheets from that event have surfaced in any public record. No contemporary press coverage confirmed it. Mentzer won regardless, which tells you something about the margins involved. The allegation can't be verified here, and it won't be stated as fact. But if it's true, it predates the most famous judging scandal in bodybuilding history by 4 years. And if it isn't true, the documented record of what follows is damning enough without it. What can be confirmed across 1975, 1980, and 1981, across at least 3 victims and at least 4 separate mechanisms, isn't a single bad call. It's a pattern. And patterns require a different kind of accounting than incidents. This is that accounting. The machine behind the champion. To understand how a bodybuilding competition could be shaped before the first competitor walked on stage, you need to understand what the IFBB actually was, and what it wasn't. Joe Weider and his brother Ben co-founded the International Federation of Bodybuilders in 1946. Ben ran the federation's formal governance, the rules, the affiliated national bodies, the structural credibility that allowed the IFBB to claim legitimacy in 134 member states. Joe ran everything else: the magazines, the supplement lines, the sponsorship contracts, the machinery that decided which athletes got covers and which got obscurity. His flagship publication, Muscle Builder and Power, later renamed Muscle and Fitness, was the sport's primary media outlet. What the Weiders published, competitors read. What they promoted, fans bought. The athletes who appeared in their pages were transformed into names. The athletes who didn't, weren't. One academic study described the Weiders organization as holding significant political and economic control over bodybuilding. A 2022 Washington Post investigation found that over more than 4 decades, the man who built the IFBB subverted the group's nonprofit mission. Being expelled from the IFBB, as one sports study noted, was tantamount to being drummed out of the sport. Other federations existed: the NABBA in Britain, the WBBG, eventually Nubre's own WABBA, but none of them had the infrastructure, the magazine reach, or the commercial leverage of the Weiders. Winning an IFBB show mattered. Winning everything else was close to invisible. Arnold Schwarzenegger entered that system at 20 and never really left it. Joe Weider loaned him $10,000 in the early 1970s to help purchase his first real estate investment, a transaction that established the relationship as something more personal than an endorsement contract. By 1978, Arnold appeared in Weider Products advertisements. 2 days before being sworn in as governor of California in November 2003, he signed a consulting contract with American Media Inc., a Weider subsidiary, worth an estimated $8 million over 5 years, structured as 1% of magazine advertising revenue with a guaranteed minimum of $1 million annually. The relationship between them spanned 4 decades and moved between friendship, patronage, commerce, and institutional partnership in ways that are difficult to cleanly separate. None of this made Arnold a fraud at the physiological level. He was genuinely exceptional. In his prime, he carried 235 pounds on a 6'2" frame, a 57-inch chest, 22-inch arms, a 30-inch waist. He won the Mr. Universe title 5 times and the Mr. Olympia 6 times between 1970 and 1975. The best bodybuilders in the world competed against him during those years, and he regularly beat them. The problem wasn't whether he was good. The problem was the architecture surrounding the question of how good, and whether that architecture was capable of producing an honest answer when it mattered most. Weider needed Arnold winning to sell magazines. Arnold needed Weider's platform to build a career. By the mid-1970s, the entire economic structure of professional bodybuilding ran through a machine that had a financial stake in one man's continued dominance. That isn't corruption in the way a bribed referee is corruption. It's something more structural, and in some ways more difficult to resist. A system that had been profitable for so long that protecting its architecture had become indistinguishable from protecting the sport. The method. Before examining specific events, the method itself requires documentation. Arnold was explicit about how he operated, in his own words, across multiple published sources. In a 1976 Rolling Stone interview conducted in Pretoria, South Africa, where he was preparing for the 1975 Mr. Olympia, which had already been filmed, he described an incident from the 1970 Olympia where he and Sergio Oliva were locked in a pose-down before the judges. The crowd was split. The outcome was genuinely uncertain. Arnold told Oliva they should both quit. Enough posing. Let's walk off. Oliva agreed, turned, and left. Arnold didn't. He stayed on stage and kept hitting poses. In his own words, he said, "Good enough," and just walked off. But he didn't watch what I was doing, so I stayed there and kept hitting another shot. The audience's energy turned against Oliva for abandoning the floor. Arnold won his first Mr. Olympia title that night, in a room that had considered the outcome open 30 seconds earlier. By 1977, he had codified the approach into something replicable and teachable. In the We magazine interview that year, he described his method with competitors he wanted to unsettle. "I make them feel great. I tell a guy that he's never looked better, that he looks brilliant, fantastic. You're deltoids, and how did you get the tan and the proportion? I'm positive that you'll place. You'll beat Frank. I think you'll even beat Corny. You can easily beat this guy and that guy. I'm certain you'll go all the way to second place." The sentence ends on second place. The competitor has been told he will lose, and the delivery was warm enough that he might not notice immediately what had been done to him. The inverse was equally deliberate. Recounting his approach to Tim Ferriss in 2015, he described targeting a competitor's specific physical vulnerability. "It was very clear when I said to someone, 'Let me ask you something. Do you have any knee injuries?' Then they'd say, 'No, why?' I'd say, 'Because your thighs look a little slimmer to me.' And I'd see them for 2 hours in the gym, always going in front of the mirror and checking out their thighs." The man had arrived at the gym confident. He left auditing himself. His focus was no longer on the competition. It was on a flaw that might not have existed before the conversation. He wrote about this openly in his new Encyclopedia of Modern Bodybuilding, devoting an entire chapter to psychological warfare and stating his philosophy directly. Anyone who wishes to claim the title of champion should be the master of his own mind as well as of his sport. If he isn't, and your psyching him out throws him, then he has no business complaining. That is the competitor's version of these tactics. What makes the cases that follow different is that by 1975, the methods had begun moving off the posing floor and into the institutional structures surrounding it. There was also a pattern developing in contest results that predates the most famous incident. At the 1977 IFBB Mr. Universe in Nimes, France, Mentzer arrived 10 points ahead of his closest rival on the official scorecards, then watched as those scorecards were discarded in an unprecedented decision, the outcome to be determined instead by audience applause during a pose-down. Ben Weider personally promised to investigate. The investigation never happened. Mentzer had lost on the official numbers, then lost again when the numbers were thrown out. That kind of institutional sleight of hand requires a specific kind of confidence, the confidence of a system that does not expect to be held accountable. Case 2. Serge Nubre, excluded before he could win. Serge Nubre was born in Guadeloupe in 1938. By the mid-1970s, he was among the most physically imposing bodybuilders alive. A 57-inch chest, a 27-inch waist, competing at nearly 6 feet tall, with a definition in his abdominal musculature that competitors and observers described as something closer to sculpture than anatomy. He had placed third at the 1973 Mr. Olympia, served as an IFBB vice president, and built the kind of international reputation that made his name recognizable in competitive bodybuilding circles across multiple continents. Arnold, by multiple accounts within the bodybuilding community, considered Nubre the one competitor who genuinely threatened to beat him. That specific assessment, not Ferrigno, not Mentzer, not Zane, but Nubre, circulated among those close to both men. The physique he presented in his prime was the kind that judges trained to reward symmetry, mass, and conditioning found difficult to score against. The 1975 Mr. Olympia, held in Pretoria, South Africa, was filmed for the documentary Pumping Iron, and was supposed to represent the definitive confrontation between the two. The documentary was already being made. The cameras were already rolling. What those cameras didn't record was the conversation between Federation officials and Serge Nubre that happened 12 days before the contest. The IFBB informed him he had been suspended. Nubre was a professional bodybuilder. His entire physical infrastructure, the muscle density, the separation, the conditioning visible in photographs from that era, required constant maintenance. You don't build a physique at his level and then stop training for 12 days before a major contest without consequences that are both measurable and irreversible on that specific timeline. He couldn't hold his peak. No one could. He stopped training and lost more than 12 pounds. 12 pounds of conditioning, stripped from a physique that had taken years to construct, with no time to recover. The official reason the IFBB gave? His appearance in an erotic film, which the Federation disapproved of. Nubre's own account was different. Certain individuals in the IFBB had been filling Ben Weider's ears with falsehoods and baseless rumors, he said. He later stated publicly that he believed he would have beaten Arnold in 1975 had he been permitted to compete at full conditioning. Not a boast from a man in decline, but a specific assessment from a competitor who knew his own body and had just watched 12 pounds of it disappear. He also alleged, according to those close to him, that after the contest he discovered what he described as a plot against all black contestants, and that his organizing of a collective response among black competitors contributed to his receiving a lifetime expulsion from the IFBB afterward. That last detail isn't a minor footnote. Nubre wasn't just an elite athlete. He was a black man from the French Caribbean, competing within a federation structure controlled by white American commercial interests at the height of the apartheid era, in a country that had just invested several $100,000 in hosting the Bodybuilding World Championships as a means of international legitimacy, despite being banned from the Olympics for its racial policies. The Rolling Stone reporter covering the 1975 contest noted that black competitors like Robbie Robinson were staying at South African hotels immune from apartheid, courtesy of the South African Ministry of Sports. The politics of who was welcome and on whose terms were embedded in the environment of the event itself. The 1975 official result? Arnold Schwarzenegger, 191 points, first. Serge Nubre, 178 points, second. 12 days without training showing in the 13-point gap. The final overall decision between the two division winners went 4-3 to Arnold in the judge vote. 7 judges separated a competition's legitimacy from its controversy by a single ballot. After the lifetime ban, Nubre founded his own federation, the World Amateur Bodybuilding Association, in 1975. He joined Dan Lurie's World Bodybuilding Guild Federation in 1976. He won the NABA Pro Mr. Universe in 1976 and the WBBG Pro Mr. World and WBBG Mr. Olympus in 1977. He competed at an elite level for years after the IFBB expelled him. The Federation had not expelled him because he stopped being capable of winning. They had expelled him while he still was. No direct evidence links Arnold personally to the order suspending Nubre 12 days before the 1975 contest. Nubre's public statements blamed the Federation and the Weider machine generally, rather than Arnold by name. The distinction matters for accuracy and should be stated clearly. This is an institutional case, not an individual one. What the record shows is a federation with financial reasons to protect its champion, removing the competitor who most credibly threatened him, on grounds that Nubre himself disputed, at a moment when the timing made defeat on the stage impossible. That is what institutional corruption looks like when it works quietly. The case against the 1980 event is different. In 1980, The mechanisms are documented, specific, and named. Case 3. Sydney, October 4th, 1980. Picture the posing floor at the Sydney Opera House on October 3rd, 1980, the night before the contest. Prejudging. The lights are adjusted for film cameras that will eventually not be used because the broadcast network decides to walk away from its contract rather than associate itself with the outcome. The competitors are already in the building, oiled, rehearsing mandatory poses, studying each other in the peripheral vision that every professional bodybuilder develops, sizing up condition, reading the judge's response. Mike Mentzer had been preparing for this contest since February. Not since summer, not since late spring, since February. 8 months of competition preparation for an October contest, the longest diet and training cycle of his life. His physique entering the 1980 season was at a level that a subsequent published source described without ambiguity. Mentzer and Chris Dickerson were in the best shape of their lives. He was 28 years old, at the peak of his physical capacity, methodically prepared to a degree that no one in the building could match in terms of pure duration of effort. Arnold Schwarzenegger had been retired from competitive bodybuilding since 1975. 5 years. He returned to the stage in 1980, claiming the purpose was preparation for Conan the Barbarian. An explanation that Frank Zane, for one, found less than complete. Zane later offered a documented alternative account. Something Arnold had said to him, or that Zane had said to Arnold, had gotten under Arnold's skin in the months leading up to the contest. It really bugged him, Zane recalled of Arnold's response. I think to get back at me for that remark was part of his motivation to enter the 1980 Mr. Olympia. Whatever the motivation, Arnold arrived in Sydney carrying a physique that observers at the time described as suboptimal for a man competing at the Olympia level. The EBSCO-indexed academic journal article published subsequently described what followed in Sydney as Arnold's unaccountable victory. That word, unaccountable, appears in a credentialed published source, not a fan forum. An academic database used in university research libraries indexed a bodybuilding retrospective that found the result couldn't be explained by the competitive evidence on display. Assembling the panel. 7 judges were assigned to the 1980 Mr. Olympia. Look at who they were and what they each had in common with the eventual winner. Albert Busek, Germany. Documentation describes him as an old friend who helped enable Arnold to compete in his first Mr. Universe competition back in 1966. Not an acquaintance, not someone who knew Arnold's name, a man who had personally opened the door to Arnold's international debut 14 years earlier. He had remained close to Arnold in the years since. Reg Park, South Africa. The name will be familiar to anyone who has read Arnold's own origin story. Reg Park was the bodybuilder whose photograph on the cover of a muscle magazine in an Austrian store gave a 15-year-old Arnold Schwarzenegger his blueprint. Arnold described Park as his childhood idol, his mentor, and his friend, a relationship that began in 1966 when they met at Bennett's Gym in London and deepened over the following years. Park's connection to Arnold wasn't professional. It was personal and formative. Brendan Ryan, Australia. Mitz Kawashima, USA. Jacques Blomart, Belgium. Dan Howard, USA. Historian John Fair, in a credentialed historical analysis of the event, concluded that 4 of the 7 judges were arguably predisposed towards Arnold, owing largely to personal considerations. 4 of 7. In a panel where majority rules, that is the majority. Now look at who was removed before that panel sat down. Bill Pearl, multiple-time Mr. Universe winner, one of the most respected technical judges in bodybuilding history, a man who had actually competed at the elite level and understood from the inside what elite conditioning looked like. Pearl withdrew because he had helped prepare Chris Dickerson for the contest. After the results were announced, Pearl stated publicly what he would have done. He would have placed Arnold 5th. 5th. In a panel with Pearl present and voting his professional assessment, Chris Dickerson wins the 1980 Mr. Olympia. Frank Zane wins the 1980 Mr. Olympia. Mike Mentzer places higher than 5th. The entire result inverts. Roger Schwab also withdrew from the 1980 panel. He had been involved in Mike Mentzer's preparation, which created a conflict of interest running in the same direction as Pearl's, against the eventual winner. Both judges who might have scored against Arnold, gone. Their departures were framed as ethical recusals. The replacements weren't equivalently clean. Then there was Peter McCarthy. McCarthy was a veteran judge with established experience at elite-level IFBB events. He was credentialed, he knew what he was doing. Hours before the contest began, not days, not weeks, not in the weeks of organizational preparation, hours before the first competitor walked on stage, McCarthy was pulled from the panel. The documented description of the circumstances? Curious. His replacement was identified in subsequent accounts as a longtime personal friend of Arnold's. This individual's judging credentials had been formally revoked 2 months earlier, specifically because of bad judging. Not because of a conflict of interest, not because of an administrative irregularity, because the Federation's own evaluation process had determined he wasn't competent to judge bodybuilding competitions. He judged this one. The event promoter managing the entire contest, Paul Graham, was simultaneously producing a documentary film about Arnold's comeback, a film that had commercial value only if the comeback ended in victory. Graham managed the venue, the schedule, and the competitive environment, and had a financial stake in a specific outcome within it. That conflict of interest wasn't disclosed to competitors or judges as a condition of their participation. What the scorecards showed. Prejudging results, 3 competitive rounds. Arnold Schwarzenegger, 295 points. Frank Zane, 291. Chris Dickerson, 290. Mike Mentzer, 280. Boyer Co., 280. The gap between first and second was 4 points. Between first and third, 5 points. In a sport where one judge's opinion can shift a score, and where 4 of your 7 judges have documented personal relationships with the current leader, 5 points isn't a safe margin. 5 points is the margin inside which those relationships operate. The pose down, the final round in which judges cast individual first-place votes, went 5-2. Arnold received 5, Dickerson received 2. Final official totals, Arnold, 300. Dickerson, 292. Bill Pearl said he would have placed Arnold 5th. Run that assessment through the arithmetic. With Pearl's vote replacing one of the 5 Arnold votes in the pose down, and with Pearl's prejudging scores on the basis of his documented professional assessment favoring Dickerson, the 5-2 pose down narrows. With one qualified independent judge removed from the panel and replaced by someone whose credentials had been pulled for incompetence, the margin of Arnold's victory across 3 prejudging rounds was 5 points. 5 points that a panel member whose credentials were pulled for incompetence helped produce. Mike Mentzer scored 280 in the prejudging and placed 5th overall. He had received a perfect score in the heavyweight class the previous year. He had started his diet in February. What happened after the results were read? The announcement echoed through the Sydney Opera House, and for approximately 800 of the 2,000 people present, the response was immediate and vocal. 40% of the crowd began booing. Not polite disagreement, sustained booing at a result that seemed, to nearly half the paying audience, wrong enough to say so out loud. Chris Dickerson, who had been assessed in Iron Man magazine as possessing superb physique and incredible posing, and evaluated at an almost perfect 99 in the scoring, didn't take it quietly. He jumped off the stage. Multiple witnesses documented him saying he couldn't believe it. He had spent his competitive life building toward exactly this moment, and arrived in the best condition of that life, and been told by 7 judges, 4 of whom had documented personal relationships with the winner, that he had come second. Frank Zane went backstage and found something to hit. His trophy was there. He smashed it against the wall. Zane was the reigning champion, the 3-time defending title holder, the man whose remarks to Arnold may have precipitated the comeback in the first place. He had watched his own return to form produce a 291 in the prejudging, a score that, under any reasonable assessment, represented a genuine challenge for the title, and finished third. Mike Mentzer found Arnold backstage. The confrontation that followed was documented in Mentzer's own account of what happened. Arnold's response to his challenge about the result was specific and dismissive. "You lost because of your enormous belly." Mentzer had been on a competition diet since February. His condition had been described by an independent, published source as among the best of his life. The contest was in October. The claim that he had presented a flawed physique was, by the documented evidence of his preparation and the independent assessment of his condition, not accurate. Before the event, at a pre-contest press conference, Mentzer had reportedly attempted to physically confront Arnold. The pressure between them had been building for 2 years. Mentzer described the trajectory himself. "It was only during 1978 to 79, when I continued to write and became more popular, that he, Arnold, started to dislike me. This wasn't random friction generated by competitive proximity." Mentzer's heavy-duty training system, low volume, high intensity, built on Arthur Jones' scientific principles, requiring 3 training days per week rather than the 6 days per week high-volume approaches that Weider's magazines promoted and that Arnold embodied, wasn't just an athletic rival to Arnold's legacy. It was an intellectual and commercial one. Mentzer was building a following, selling his own courses, publishing his own material, and attracting readers who might otherwise have been buying Weider products guided by Arnold's philosophy. The friction between them was structural before it became personal. CBS had contracted to broadcast 3 consecutive Mr. Olympia contests, beginning with the 1980 event. After seeing the footage from Sydney, CBS declined to produce it. Their executives subsequently showed that footage privately to Chris Dickerson, specifically to demonstrate to him, in their own documented framing, that the judge's poor decision was visible on film. CBS then separated from the competition entirely. The following year, despite holding broadcast rights to the 1981 contest, they didn't send a film crew. Television broadcast networks don't walk away from contracted sports events because the wrong person won a subjective competition. The subjectivity is the point. The sport exists because reasonable people can disagree about the result, and that uncertainty is what makes the broadcast watchable. CBS walked away because the footage they had in their possession wasn't a document of reasonable disagreement. It was something else. The IFBB's response. In November 1980, 6 weeks after Sydney, the IFBB convened a Congress in Manila. The delegates passed a formal resolution. Contest organizers would no longer be permitted to select the Olympia judging panel. Going forward, an independent judging director would choose the judges. Read that sequence carefully. The problem the resolution solved, organizers selecting judges, was exactly the problem that Paul Graham's conflict of interest had made visible in Sydney. The IFBB didn't issue a statement of concern. They didn't convene a review. They passed a rule closing the specific door that had allowed the panel to be assembled the way it was assembled. Organizations rewrite rules in response to events that expose their existing vulnerabilities. The Manila Resolution is as close to an institutional admission as federations issue. Case 4, 1981. The system after its architect. Arnold Schwarzenegger didn't compete at the 1981 Mr. Olympia. He wasn't a judge. Whether he was involved in the judging selection process isn't documented in any confirmed source, and stating otherwise would overstate what the record actually supports. The prosecutorial integrity of this case file depends on the distinction being maintained. What the record does support is this. Arnold Schwarzenegger and his business partner Jim Lorimer co-promoted the 1981 Mr. Olympia. The event was held in Columbus, Ohio on October 10, 1981. Arnold sent personal letters to competitors inviting participation in a concurrent event, the Mr. International contest held alongside the Olympia. His name was on the promotional apparatus. He organized the show. And Roger Schwab, the man who had withdrawn from the 1980 judging panel under contested circumstances, served as the head judge of the 1981 Mr. Olympia. That institutional continuity is documented and specific. The same individual who removed himself from one controversial panel became the lead judge of the following year's event, which was co-promoted by the man who had most directly benefited from the previous year's outcome. No single fact about 1981 is more structurally significant than that one. Frank Zane boycotted. Boyer Co. boycotted. Mike Mentzer boycotted.
3 of the most credentialed active competitors in the sport refused to appear. CBS, despite holding broadcast rights, didn't send a film crew. Wikipedia's article on the 1981 Mr. Olympia describes it as arguably the most controversial Olympia of all time, a characterization that should be considered alongside the fact that the field was depleted by the boycott of its most prominent, legitimate challengers before a single competitor walked on stage. 7 judges voted. 4 competitors received votes. Franco Columbu, Chris Dickerson, Tom Platz, and Danny Padilla each received some portion of the 7 ballots. Columbu, Dickerson, and Platz each received 2 votes. Padilla received 1. Columbu won on tiebreaker. Franco Columbu was Arnold Schwarzenegger's closest personal friend and long-standing training partner. His competitive credentials were genuine. He had won the 1976 Mr. Olympia legitimately, had been competing at elite level since the late 1960s, and was a serious athlete by any reasonable measurement. He also competed in 1981 while recovering from a recent leg injury, an imbalance documented in multiple contemporary accounts describing limited muscular development in his legs as a direct consequence of the injury. Tom Platz, nicknamed the Quad Father for possessing what was widely acknowledged as the most developed leg musculature of any elite competitor of his generation, placed 3rd. Tom Platz hasn't provided confirmed, verbatim statements claiming he was robbed at the 1981 contest. A YouTube video about the event carries a title suggesting Platz framed his 1981 result as something he had failed to accomplish rather than something that had been done to him. A prosecution built on a quote that doesn't exist in the primary record isn't a prosecution worth running, and it won't be run here.
The institutional case stands without it. Arnold promoted the event. The head judge was the man who had withdrawn from the previous year's scandal. 3 credentialed champions refused to participate. CBS abandoned the broadcast. And Arnold's closest personal friend won a split decision in a field hollowed out by the boycott of everyone who had objected loudest to 1980. One documented contemporary assessment of the 1981 result put it directly. The decision to award Franco the winner of the 1981 Mr. Olympia is the worst decision in the history of the contest. The year before was bad, but this was worse. The 1981 Mr. Olympia is what an institution looks like after it has been shaped by one man's interests for a decade. The architect doesn't need to be at the construction site every day for the building to reflect his blueprints. On steroids. Before the closing section, a necessary detour. Steroids. Arnold admitted to using testosterone and Dianabol for 8 to 10 weeks before competition in a 1977 WE magazine interview. His own words from that interview. Steroids are taking 8 to 9 to 10 weeks before a competition. It's not a healthy thing to do, but it's being used. In 2005, he stated he had no regrets about it in the context of the era. In a 2018 Men's Health interview, reflecting on the drugs athletes were taking then versus now, he acknowledged the gap. You weren't doing it, you would fall behind, so we limited it to a couple months before competition so that we wouldn't be on it at all times. Every serious competitor at the top level in the 1970s and 1980s used anabolic steroids. Academic literature on the period describes their use as near universal at the professional and elite amateur levels. Mike Mentzer began using Dianabol at 19 at his first major competition. Chris Dickerson used. Frank Zane used.
The competitive chemistry across the field was roughly parallel.
The argument in this case file isn't about pharmacology. Chemistry doesn't explain why an experienced veteran judge was removed hours before competition and replaced by a personal friend whose credentials had been pulled for bad judging 2 months earlier. Chemistry doesn't explain why the IFBB rewrote its own panel selection rules 6 weeks after the contest. Chemistry doesn't explain why CBS walked away from a contracted broadcast deal after reviewing the footage.
Chemistry doesn't explain why 4 of 7 judges had documented personal relationships with the man who won by 5 points in the prejudging. The manipulation was in the structure, not the bloodstream. The highest price. Mike Mentzer was born November 15, 1951, in Germantown, Pennsylvania, and arrived at everything he did completely. At 12, he received a barbell set for Christmas and spent the entire holiday in the basement lifting it. At 14, he sat down with a copy of Muscle Builder magazine and wrote on the inside cover, Mike Mentzer, Mr. America, 1972. Mike Mentzer, Mr. Universe, 1974. Mike Mentzer, Mr. Olympia, 1976. He was 4 years behind that schedule when he finally won the Mr. America title in October 1976 at Madison Square Garden, the same contest where he reportedly should have won by a wider margin than the official tally suggested. He didn't dwell on it. He moved. By 1978, in Acapulco, Mexico, competing at 216 pounds at the IFBB Mr. Universe, Mentzer received a perfect score of 300. Not exceptional, not near perfect, perfect. The first perfect score in IFBB competition history. Not the first great score, not the highest score that year. The first time in the history of international bodybuilding competition that every judge in the room had looked at a competitor and found no basis for deduction. In 1979, at the Mr. Olympia heavyweight class, he did it again. Another 300, losing only the overall title to Frank Zane in a split decision that most contemporary observers found difficult to justify. He had also received 3 other perfect scores across professional circuit events that year, in Miami, in Pittsburgh, and across multiple prejudging rounds. His training philosophy, heavy duty, built on Arthur Jones' high-intensity principles and refined through years of personal testing, was described in a 2015 Gale Academic Journal article as having seemed on the verge of transforming bodybuilding during the year between the 1979 and 1980 contests. Reps got lower, weights got larger. Recovery became a training variable rather than an afterthought. The philosophy held that most bodybuilders were overtrained, not undertrained, that the traditional volume approach promoted by Weider's magazines was producing overuse and diminishing returns rather than the gains it claimed to deliver. Mentzer trained 3 days per week for his Mr. America victory. In an industry built around the mythology of more being better, that was a commercial challenge as much as a scientific one. Peter McGough, the bodybuilding journalist who spent more time on Mentzer's profile than any other piece he wrote across a career spanning decades, documented what the pre-1980 landscape actually looked like from inside the sport. It seemed possible that Mike's popularity could eventually outstrip that of the great Arnold Schwarzenegger. Many feel that Mike's growing prestige, in tandem with his training beliefs representing the antithesis of Arnold's 20 sets of body part regimen, was the catalyst that drove the Austrian to seemingly dislike the young upstart. Mentzer knew it. He described the shift himself. Arnold started to dislike him in 1978 and 1979, specifically when Mentzer continued to write and became more popular. His mail-order, heavy-duty courses, marketed through Weider's own publications, before Mentzer eventually had enough leverage to build independently, were selling in what McGough described as phenomenal numbers. Readers were buying training philosophy that contradicted everything the magazine's primary product line, supplements designed for high-volume training, was built to support. He then prepared for Sydney with 8 months of focus and walked into the Sydney Opera House on October 4, 1980, in the best physical condition of his life. He scored 280 in the prejudging and placed 5th, behind Arnold Schwarzenegger, Frank Zane, Chris Dickerson, and Boyer Coe, in that order. What followed is documented in detail by McGough, whose profile of Mentzer constitutes the most thorough account of what the 1980 result cost a specific human being. The retirement was immediate. Mentzer never competed again after that night. Not a hiatus, not a sabbatical, not a year off to recalibrate. Finished. A competitive career that had been building toward one specific night since 1965 was over
at 28. The decade that followed is documented in clinical terms that are difficult to read. Multiple hospitalizations, multiple instances of arrest, periods of reclusive behavior so complete that people who had known him professionally stopped expecting to hear from him. By January 1990, sitting alone in a psychiatric ward where he had been confined for 4 weeks, he stared at what he later described as clinically scrubbed walls and understood that something had to change.
McGough wrote that he had been written off as a crazy by most of those who had once been peers, friends, and associates. The man who had written his competitive goals in a magazine at 14 years old was 40 years old and institutionalized. The amphetamines had started in the summer of 1979, in the months following his mother's death, not as escape, not as recreation, but as a pharmaceutical attempt to maintain focus through the grief and through the final preparation cycle for the 1979 Olympia. His mother died in May. He competed in October. By 1980, the boundary between functional and destructive had blurred in ways that the contest result did nothing to correct. He had built himself into peak condition, partly on chemical support, arrived at the definitive contest of his career, lost to an outcome he didn't believe reflected the competitive reality on the stage, confronted the man he held responsible, and received as a response a comment about his belly.
The trajectory after that wasn't a straight line into collapse. It rarely is. But the rupture point is documented, and the direction of the trajectory isn't in dispute. Mentzer had built his competitive and intellectual philosophy on a specific foundation, an Ayn Rand-influenced conviction that reality is knowable, that rational assessment produces accurate results, that merit in a measurable domain produces outcomes proportional to quality. The 1980 Mr. Olympia handed him a direct encounter with the gap between that conviction and what had actually been constructed around the event. A scoring panel stocked with old friends. A veteran judge removed hours before competition and replaced with someone whose credentials had been pulled for incompetence. A promoter filming a comeback documentary in the back room. The collision between his philosophy and that reality wasn't abstract, and it wasn't temporary. It was permanent. In 1990, in that ward, he made a decision. He returned to what he knew, to training, to writing, to consulting, to articulating the heavy-duty principles that no one had scientifically disproved, only institutionally inconvenienced. He spent the 1990s rebuilding something quieter, client consultations, articles, a smaller audience than he had imagined at 14, but an audience that engaged seriously with what he was saying. His ideas about recovery, about the minimum effective training stimulus, about the relationship between volume and adaptation, have influenced coaches and athletes who came after him. Some of them may not know his name, or what the environment that shaped those ideas cost him to navigate. His brother Ray had followed him into the sport. The 1976 Junior Mr. America, later the IFBB Mr. USA in 1978, the AAU Mr. America in 1979. They competed in parallel. Siblings who had grown up in the same house in Ephrata, Pennsylvania, trained under the same principles, built their bodies against each other as a reference point, the way brothers do. Ray died within days of Mike. Both gone in June 2001, within the same week, the two men who had carried the Mentzer name through every significant moment in that competitive story. Mike Mentzer died June 10th, 2001. He was 49 years old. In the preface Peter McGough wrote for the posthumous republication of the Mentzer profile, there is a single note about the period after Sydney. Arnold Schwarzenegger called Mike Mentzer after the contest. The two buried their differences. The specific conversation isn't on any public record. What it didn't undo was the result, the retirement, the decade that followed the retirement, or what the retirement cost the sport in terms of what Mentzer might have spent those years building instead. The temporal frame.
A note before closing. This case file is an indictment of a competitive environment and the decisions made within it during a specific period. It isn't a verdict on the man Arnold Schwarzenegger became after that period. The figure who stood in the Sydney Opera House in October 1980 was the product of 2 decades of absolute refusal to accept any outcome other than first place. A psychology documented in his own words, published in his own books, stated openly in his own interviews across multiple decades. He operated within a structure that had financial reasons to support his continued dominance, had judges on the 1980 panel who had known him personally since 1966, and had a promoter with a commercial stake in the outcome. Whether Arnold directed those arrangements explicitly or whether the system that had formed around him over 15 years operated according to its own institutional logic without requiring his daily instruction, the record does not resolve that question cleanly, and overstating the claim would undermine the case. The honest answer is that it may have been both, and that the distinction matters less than it first appears, when the outcome is the same either way. What the record resolves, the mechanism, the scoring anomaly, the removal of qualified judges, the appointment of a compromised replacement, the promoter's conflict, the crowd reaction, the CBS decision, and the IFBB's subsequent rule change that acknowledged exactly what had gone wrong. The evidence is institutional, not confessional. It's also sufficient. The man who told Men's Health in 2018 that, looking back, I stepped over the line several times, and I was the first one to say sorry, isn't the same figure who stood backstage in Sydney and told a competitor who had been on a diet since February that he had lost because of his belly. People change across 4 decades. The record from 1980 stays where it Mike Mentzer wasn't one unlucky competitor who drew a hostile environment on an important night. He was the highest-priced casualty of a system that had already removed Serge Nubre from competition 5 years earlier, when his conditioning represented a genuine threat. Suspended 12 days before the contest, denied the chance to compete in the condition he had built. He was the highest-priced casualty of a structure that had removed a qualified veteran judge hours before Sydney and replaced him with a personal friend whose credentials had been pulled for demonstrated incompetence. A system in which the event promoter had a documentary in production. A system that had been built over 15 years of intertwined financial and competitive interests, maintained by an organization whose institutional response to the controversy was to quietly rewrite the rule that had made the controversy possible. 3 perfect scores in his career, 8 months of preparation for 1 contest, a training philosophy that was described in credentialed academic literature as having been on the verge of transforming the sport. And on October 4th, 1980, he placed 5th. The case has been made. What it cost is what remains. Subscribe for more stories like this.